357 Magnum versus 327 Federal Magnum, and I have our Hornady critical defense ammunition here. So I'm going to use my 4 and an 1/8 inch barrel Smith & Wesson 686 to test the 357 Magnum, and my 4.2 inch barrel Ruger SP101 to test the 327 Federal Magnum. So before I move on here, I just want to mention that this 327 Federal Magnum is very, very, very low on the scale of 327 Federal Magnum. It's loaded very light. So don't take this as gospel of what 327 Federal Magnum is, because this is a very, very light loading of it. So our 357 Magnum is a 125 grain FTX bullet. We're rated at 1,500 feet per second through an 8-inch barrel. Very interesting barrel length they use there. And our 327 Federal Magnum is rated at 1,475 feet per second through a 5-inch barrel. Very interesting. Again, that's not typical of barrel lengths for 327 Federal, but you know, this is rated at a very, very low level, very low energy for 327 Federal. Our 357 Magnum, well, that's rated to an unrealistic barrel, but I'm still going to see what I get here anyway. So we're going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy I get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So I'm going to go into plain 10% clear ballistics gel to see what the best potential of those cartridges are. No denim in the way to clog a hollow point or anything like that. Then I'll move on to do more of a real world simulation where I'm going to have 4 layers of denim on this first 3-inch piece that represents our pectoral muscle. After that, a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum. 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and then another 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard at the back of this block to represent hitting back ribs. So clear ballistics is roughly a half representation of the density of flesh. So when we're talking 3 inches and 16 inches, that really equates to more like 1.5 inches and about 8 inches in an actual living target. So we'll do a plain clear ballistics shot, then a real world simulation shot, and then I will shoot at the steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 357 Magnum 125 grain FTX. If I didn't mention it, the 327 Federal is an 80 grain FTX, so a lot lighter bullet. So this is rated at 1,500 feet per second through an 8-inch barrel. I'll see what I get in my 4 1/4 inch barrel here. $13.39, $13.66, $13.54, $13.57, $13.80. So kind of low on the power, you know, because a 125 grain Magnum is generally moving at 1,450 feet per second out of that gun. So 327 Federal Magnum, really tiny little cartridge here, and we are rated at 1,475 feet per second through a 5-inch barrel. So let's see what I get in my 4.2 inch barrel, see how close I get to that 1,475 feet per second. $14.74, $14.42, $14.71, $14.64, $14.51. So to be honest here, I thought I was going to be like about 1,300 feet per second. So that's actually pretty good. And yeah, it's not that powerful necessarily. It's in 9mm range because this is a very, very lowly loaded one. One thing I can say though is out of this revolver, that had less recoil than a 9mm out of a full-size pistol. So very, very low recoil for the amount of velocity we're getting. So very nice. Let's hit our ballistics gel block and see how these two compare. All right, we'll do our first shot in the plain clear ballistics gel, no denim in the way to clog a hollow point. These are FTX bullets, so the hollow point is, you know, already filled in. But sometimes I've noticed that, you know, denim can make a difference on these particular bullet styles. So no denim and no rib simulation in there to slow down its potential for penetration either. So let's see what we get with our 357 Magnum. All right, set that with our 327 Federal Magnum. Let's go take a look. All right, I'm honestly surprised by that performance, and I'm also surprised by that recoil. You know, the first thing that always happens, even though I understand that the recoil is low, is I'll go to shoot the ballistic gel block and I'll kind of flinch a little bit thinking there's a lot of recoil because it's a Magnum, and there's almost none. But considering there's almost none, I'm really surprised at how well this did. When we look at the energy dump, you know, a 357 mag on the bottom, our 327 on top, you know, our 357 mag did better. However, that 327 did really, really well. It did a lot better than typical like 9mm from full-size pistols, etc. So a lot of energy dump. But then once we get into the block, there's, you know, that 327 is creating 90% of what the damage of that 357 is creating. So it's very, very similar overall. Our 357 Magnum, we went to 15¼ inches of penetration and good expansion, so that's really, really good performance. With our 327 Federal Magnum, we went to 16½ inches of penetration, so in some regard a little bit better because we had a little bit more adequate penetration while still getting most of that damage. So that looks really, really good overall. So let's put on our denim, put in our rib simulation, and see how these compare in our real world simulation. All right, our real world simulation, 4 layers of denim followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent our pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and then another 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard at the back. So let's see how our 357 Magnum does. All right, let me set that back up and hit it with the 327 Federal Magnum. All right, 327 Federal Magnum, our real world simulation. I'm gonna try to go a little bit higher here. Let's go take a look. All right, so that's some pretty interesting performance because we had some bullet rollback. A lot of bullet rollback with that 327 Federal Magnum. So our first 3-inch piece here, it's hard to see this now, but you know, the energy dump is almost as good with that 327 as that 357 Magnum. But I'm gonna be honest, you're half the recoil in a gun that's already 10 ounces lighter. So not bad performance overall. We look at our rib simulation, it's clear that, you know, not only is the 357 Magnum bigger, but it definitely did have a little more percentage of expansion before hitting this. So that's actually a pretty fantastic performance. But when you look at this is actually really good too, because that's actually a bigger hole than typical 9mm. You know, so both of those are doing quite well. When we look at our 357 Magnum, we had really good expansion and mushrooming. We went to 16¼ inches. That was the same that we had with our 327 in plain gel, and then it rolled back a little bit. With our 327, that thing rolled back in that channel really far, and generally when that happens, what that means is, you know, that's creating a large hole through there, and then it's so much larger than the actual size of the bullet that it rolls back in that channel. You know, and those petals might have actually peeled back, you know, before it did that. But we have a total penetration with our 327 Federal Magnum of 14¼ inches, and then that bullet rolled all the way back to like 7 inches. So that doesn't mean it did bad, it just means the way this gel is, sometimes that's the effect that it has. But both of those are pretty good there. So obviously our 357 Magnum did better. It did a little more damage, it would be a little bit more effective. However, the amount of recoil of having something that is less recoil than a 9mm out of a full-size pistol, but actually doing better than a 9mm out of a full-size pistol, I would say that 327 Federal, this loading is actually a pretty effective option. That's a pretty good performing cartridge overall. So, you know, it's one of those things, it's like something might be better, but is the juice worth the squeeze? You know, you're barely having any squeeze there with that 327, and you're milking out a really good performance as worth that 357 Magnum. That still had low recoil for what it is, compared to typical 357 Magnum, and it did really well, but I mean, it had more recoil. So very good on both of these cartridges. They did pretty well. So let's pull these out of the block. We'll take a close up look at them. Then I'll shoot our steel and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability and recoil control I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through plain gel, our 357 Magnum and our 327 Federal Magnum. Our 357 had really good expansion. It did fragment out a little bit there on one side. The jacket's kind of thin on these critical defense, so sometimes that can happen. But pretty good performance overall for what it is. Our 327 Federal Magnum, you know, that expanded out quite well, but it just kind of rolled itself back a little bit. So kind of more consistent in some regard, but that's just simply from not having quite as much energy to work with there. And when we look at our bullets going through plain gel, you know, our 357 Magnum almost became more consistent, but our 327 didn't change at all. So when we look at our 357 Magnum going through our denim and our rib simulation, it peeled those petals back a little bit better. But our 327 Federal Magnum looks pretty much identical to the one going through the plain gel. You know, pretty much the same size overall. It's hard for me to tell them apart. You know, as we're our 357 Magnum, I can tell those apart from the plain gel and the rib simulation and denim. So very good performance overall. So that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target, so I just want to see what kind of, you know, follow-up shots and accuracy I can get in that regard. This Smith & Wesson 686, I believe it weighs something like 39.5 ounces, as where this SP101 weighs like 29.5 ounces. So big difference there in the amount of weight that each revolver has. So that actually will lower the recoil of this a little bit more than the percentage that this will lower its recoil. But let's see what I get here. 357 Magnum, 14 yards. See how quick I can do follow-up shots. All right, not too bad overall. I mean, definitely lower than typical 357 Magnum, but it takes a little bit of skill there to control that. 327 Federal, let's see what this does. All right, so, you know, I'm not seeing a huge difference in my ability to land those in target faster, but there is just a little bit more reduction in recoil there. So it's a little bit easier, but with the trigger of this particular revolver, it takes a little bit more time than the Smith & Wesson. So I'd say they're pretty equal, except for just a little bit less pressure in my wrist with that 327. So, you know, they're equal as far as shooting quickly, but there's still less recoil with that 327 is what I'm trying to say. So let me back it up and see how these continue to shoot from some more distance. All right, 40 yards from the target. Let's see what I can do from 40 yards with these. So just gonna do some slow fire. 357 Magnum. No, over the target somehow. All right, not too bad. I don't know how I pulled one over the target, to be honest. 327 Federal. Let's see what this does. All right, not too bad overall. And I want to show the case ejection of this with these. I haven't done that yet. So 357 Magnum. I didn't even have to push that and they came out. So that's a very low pressured load. And you know, I don't save that brass because Hornady 357 mag brass is pretty much worthless to reloaders. I will save these though, but case ejection with these, also very, very good. So let me back it up to 75 yards. All right, 75 yards from the target, mostly just for fun. 357 Magnum. Let's see where this hits for me. All right, right, so those are definitely shooting just a little bit low of my point of aim. I had to aim high shoulders to make the rest of those hits, so just kind of low for me. 327 Federal Magnum. See where these hit. All right, so I think I missed most of those, and I could not tell where those were hitting. So I just recently tested some 32 H&R, and those shot really great out of this revolver from that distance. But the 327, it just doesn't seem like it's as accurate at that distance for me, and that could just be me. But it could also just mean that the point of impact is shifted, dramatically from where a different ammo is. So looking at this ammo, I would say it's pretty good overall. That 327 Federal, that is loaded really, really light, because if I look at what I'm getting here for velocity out of this 80 grain bullet, I was roughly getting, well, actually I was getting more. I was getting more velocity with the 100 grain American Eagle. I was getting right around that 500 foot-pounds energy range with 100 grain American Eagle. So you can see how much this stuff is really loaded kind of light for 327 Federal Magnum. But that being said, there's really nothing wrong with that. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves with people commenting, oh, this isn't like this and this isn't like that. And, you test a short-barreled load in 357 Magnum and it's weak, or you test a different load that's weak, but yet you're still getting good performance. And I look at it as, if it's loaded that way, and that's the way it's supposed to be, just having that special niche load there that you can use for lower recoil doesn't take away from the other better options. So, it is what it is, and it performs pretty well. So for what this is, being something that's shooting at a very high velocity with an 80 grain bullet, it's doing really well, and that lower power, it means it has a lot less recoil. So it's not a bad round. It's just not one of those higher energy rounds that people might expect with 327 Federal Magnum. Now 357 Magnum, this is kind of weird how they have this. Critical defense in general is meant for, short barreled handguns. Yet they rate the velocity out of an 8-inch barrel. And, we're getting a little bit less there than, typical velocity out of a 4-inch barrel. But the recoil was definitely lower. So I would say overall, this is actually a really good 357 Magnum load. I would pick it as something that I would carry because it's just, performing really well with a lot less blast and flash and recoil than typical. So I would say it's not a bad option overall for what it is out of at least, this heavier revolver here. So both of them did really well in my opinion. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.